Hello and good morning and welcome to all of you. Do come and take a virtual seat. Um, I'm Elizabeth Smith. I'm the Director of Research here at BFI, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning to this webinar on how to have conversations about race in your workplace. This is a subject of particular personal interest to me. I grew up as the daughter of teachers who travelled, so I spent years as the only white girl in a school in the West Indies, the only non-Muslim girl at a school in Riyadh, and the only English-sounding person in a Scottish school. And funnily enough, the only place that I really encountered hostility was in Scotland. For me, conversations about race ought to be something that we approach with open hearts and minds, but I am aware that for many people in this country, both white and people of colour, it's an area that's fraught with fear, with bias, with low expectation, and with terror of feeling or causing offence. And for many in corporate HR, the protests post George Floyd's killing highlighted a problem which many people I spoke to see as an elephant in the room. Unless we can have conversations and respectful listening debates, then workplace culture will be unlikely to become as welcoming and as diverse as it needs to be. So please, as ever, be as interactive as you can. Ask questions in the chat box, put up your hands. I'm sure you know where the button is to raise your hand, so let's check and see if we can see them. Anybody not sure where to put that? Wonderful, absolutely fantastic. Put your hands up, ask questions, make comments, and we will take the temperature with a couple of polls now for you to fill in. While I introduce our first speaker this morning, we have Nicole McGill-Higgins. If I can trouble you to turn your mic on, Nicole, that would be fantastic. Nicole is a race equality champion, an inclusion consultant, and an award-winning mentor. She's co-chair of the CIPD Embrace Race Employee Resource Group, which was launched in 2017 to encourage conversations about race in the workplace, to lead inclusion initiatives and advocate for change. She encourages everyone to take responsibility and action for diversity and inclusion, and she's dedicated to rooting out racial injustice and becoming the voice for those who may not have the courage to speak for themselves. Nicole, you are very welcome today.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you. And hello and good morning, everyone.
Thanks. Can you tell us a bit about your background and the way that your life has shaped your views today?
Certainly. Well, similar to yourself in terms of location, I went to school in Jamaica. So I went to boarding school in Jamaica as a teenager. So I went when I was 13. And I think coming from England and going to Jamaica, I didn't want to go, by the way. I just wasn't, did not want to go. I was like, why? But ended up falling in love with Jamaica. But at the time when I went to Jamaica, there's a lot of apartheid and things like that happening in South Africa. And my mom was quite patriotic, and we were taught Black history, our own history, and you know, pre-colonial history beforehand. And then going to Jamaica, as you know, going to school in the West Indies, they don't shy away from these conversations. You know, history is history, the good, bad, and the ugly. But I think I always say to people, that's where I became very aware of my Blackness, but also proud of it. Where when I was in the UK, it was a little bit different because there wasn't any representation on TV. I think there was just Trevor McDonald. You'd go into the shops, magazines, things like that. So I didn't see anybody who looked like me. I never had a Black teacher or anything like that. So going to Jamaica was a massive cultural shock. But also that's where I think it solidified who I am, along with my mum's kind of upbringing. My dad, my family were very much, you know, be Black and proud, you know, be unapologetic. So I think it's always been in me to understand and to know where I'm coming from. And everybody should. It's not a Black thing. I think just as people, we should know our roots, we should know our history. So I went to school in Jamaica, came back to the UK. And again, that disparity, I noticed the difference. I was very aware of the differences and the lack of opportunities. I had a Jamaican accent as well, and going for job interviews, I was turned away. I had people saying, well, your accent's quite strong. I always remember this particular job interview that I went for in the city, and I left my umbrella or something. So I said goodbye, went back to get it, and I heard them kind of debriefing, and they were like, oh, she's very pretty, but she's Black. And that's when the penny just dropped. I was like, what?
What year was this?
This would have been So I came back in 91. So this would have been probably about 93, 94.
Right, right.
Yeah, 1993, 94. And that's when I thought, okay, I mean, my grandparents always said you have to work harder. I think most people,
Mm.
people of color would have heard you have to work harder than your white classmates to be successful. It's something that's almost standard. I'm hoping it's a line that I never have to use with my grandchildren, but in terms of being very aware. So I guess in answer to your question, I've always had that awareness where
Mhm.
some people haven't, but going to school in the Caribbean, you can't miss it. You know, it's evident, it's there. You see your cane fields, you learn the history, you learn pre-colonial,
Yeah,
colonial, you learn the whole lot. So it's not hidden, I would
yeah.
say.
Yeah, agreed. So you've so quite a diverse background already. When did you start to actually actively encourage race conversations in your workplace? When did you feel that you were comfortable or able or encouraged to do that?
And that's a really good question as well, because I've been thinking about this myself, because I've been really proactive and really pushing this agenda more. And I guess I didn't know terminology, D&I, diversity and inclusion. It's very much a workplace type conversation. Even the terminology BAME, if
Mhm,
you're not in this sphere, you probably don't even know what it is. Most of my friends who are not in the HR space or not in the workplace like that didn't know what BAME meant,
mhm.
although they hear it on TV and stuff. But being a manager, I've always managed, I'm not a manager at the CIPD, but in my previous roles, I've always managed multicultural groups. So Eastern European people, everybody, Brazilian,
Yeah.
different parts of Africa. And we've always had those conversations, not actively in the workplace in terms of having like a resource group, because I didn't know they existed. But in terms of me always pushing these conversations and making sure, trying to have equity within my teams, that's always been there.
Mhm.
But being at the CIPD, becoming the co-chair for the Embrace Group, that's where I would say that I probably launched into actively doing this from a work perspective, as opposed from just a human perspective or humane perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and what do you think? We've asked the panelists here, and actually Laverne Anderson also went to school in Jamaica in the 70s and came back to the UK in the 80s. So we should all have a chat and a beer at some point and talk about that. Thank you for that. What do you find the challenges and obstacles are to having conversations like this now?
I think the challenge, the good thing, well, I say the good thing, but since George Floyd's murder, there is a massive magnifying glass globally. And you have got organizations that are looking into bold leadership. And I mean, calling it out, admitting and understanding that we do have to talk about this. Where before I would always say that out of the 9 protective characteristics, race would be the poor cousin. When you think about it,
Why would that be?
and I would say, because you've got the 9 protective characteristics, 8 of them you can be of any race.
Mhm.
You can be a Muslim, gender, LGBTQ, differently abled. I tend to say differently abled than disabled. So differently abled,
Sure.
religion, you've got all the races in that, but Black or Asian or people of color, you don't. So
Mhm.
that's different. So if you get race right, you will get the rest right, because you've got everybody in all the others.
Mhm.
Conversation is very difficult, I find, because there is a defense mechanism that comes up, because it's the only one where you're saying that race, or the dominant race, which is a white race, is oppressing, suppressing, and undermining another race. And then that's where the barriers come up. Because if you're going to say, well, I've been, just example, that the example I've just given you in
Yeah.
terms of what I've been through, you say that to a group of white people, there's a discomfort there, because it's like, well, are you blaming me for that? How do I push through this? I could never understand what it's like to be a Black female or an Asian male, or a Muslim woman, or what have you. So I think because nothing resonates, people like to have an understanding of, well, how would that feel? And there just isn't. The disparity is just too much. It's like if you go to a restaurant and you say, I've never tried tofu, what does it taste like? They're going to say, well, it tastes like chicken. Why? Because I eat meat, I know what chicken tastes like.
Yeah.
And sorry, my analogies are really whack, but it's a matter of, how does that resonate with somebody? How can someone who's never experienced it
Yeah.
understand it? And especially if you're saying, well, it's actually your race that's doing this, it's very
Mhm.
uncomfortable. And then people will say things like, Nicole, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't
Yeah.
know what to say, and I don't want to be accused of being racist. I mean, if you look in the press this week or last week or this week with
Mhm.
the FA,
Yeah.
he used the terminology coloured. And anybody of age, I'm probably showing my age here, my nan used to say coloured.
Absolutely.
So
I was brought up to believe that was the polite thing. And when I went to Barbados, that was the polite word. So
100,
it's
100%.
difficult for the oldies like us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a generational thing there, but there's
Mhm,
also an educational piece, and it's to explain why do we not say these words anymore. I
mhm.
mean, we say mixed race now, and when I was
Yeah,
going to school, it was half caste, which you
yeah.
just don't say. So when we look at language, there's a power of language and an education piece that's really, really important because
Mhm,
that's how we communicate, right? Through language. So
absolutely.
for me, it's that's why I think it is difficult for people to talk about. However, at the moment, there is a massive uprising and movement that people do want to make a difference.
Yeah.
And that's good. That's it's heartwarming for me.
Sure, and in fact, one of our delegates has said that people feel afraid to engage because they might say something offensive without meaning to. How would you say to an audience of corporate HR professionals? You know, what are the ways that you think would work to reduce anxiety around these race conversations, and also what should be the realistic goals? I think, you know, we're often not sure. We know we have to have the conversations, but sometimes people aren't sure why. What would your response be to that?
I would say communication, communication, communication.
Mhm,
At the minute, it can look like tokenism. It can look like you're jumping on a bandwagon. It could look like a
mhm.
tick box exercise. And that's where you'll lose the engagement of people of color within your organization because
Yeah.
it's not believable. It's like being there, done that, what's really going to change? But you also can't silence the white voice. How is everybody in your organization feeling? So
Mhm,
to me, it would be an internal comms piece around this is why we're talking about it. This is why it's important
mhm.
because there's other pushbacks that come with this conversation. You will have other people in the organization saying, well, what about gender? What about differently abled? What about LGBTQ? What you have to look at is foster the learnings that you're having with these conversations because the learnings will go into the others. We're human at the end of the day. We're not these particular 8, 9 protected characteristics. We're not just a gender. We're not just a sexuality. We're not just a sexual orientation, should I say, or religion. We're
Mhm.
human beings. So anything, because race is so difficult to talk about, if you get race right, you will get the rest right because the other 8 everybody fits into them some way somehow. So
Mhm.
this is why race is very important. So communicate that to the organization. This is something that probably everybody's saying, and it's so true. Safe spaces are so important. Even today, I really want people to ask those burning questions that you haven't asked or you've been, again, scared to ask because of terminology. Language and terminology is a complete and utter minefield. But if you don't know how to do something, but you want to, you try, right? We're not perfect. It's a learning curve. And
Mhm.
when you communicate that, that that works. If somebody said to me, do you know what, Nicole, I'm really intrigued about racism. I don't agree with it, but I just don't know what to say. Let's have a dialogue.
Yeah.
And I've sat in listening circles, and I've had people say things like, well, Nicole, I think all lives matter. I've got black friends. I don't see color. Now, in this particular space, all of those would be trigger words or trigger terms. Like, what do you mean you don't see color? Or why were you saying all lives matter? But then instead of me getting defensive and saying, oh, you're racist, how could you say that? I would then say, so when you say all lives matter, what does that mean to you? What does
Mhm.
that look like to you? Because if anyone's followed this all lives matter and black lives matter, many people who have said all lives matter, admittedly are racist, but other people are saying, but all lives should matter. But they just have misinterpreted why we're saying black lives matter. So
Mhm.
open the dialogue because we're learning from each other. And for me, it's important to hear everybody's voice because that's what we're fighting for, equity and equality, right? We're
Yeah.
fighting for a space that people feel comfortable and have a sense of belonging, regardless of who you are. And that
Mhm.
includes Black and white, Asian, everybody. So we create the safe space within your organization. ERG groups are really important because we've had a massive impact at the CIPD because it's not HR, because people look at HR as a police of an organization. They just do the salaries, your sick leave, your disciplinaries. They don't understand the intricacy of HR and maybe the role. And
Yeah.
people probably wouldn't feel comfortable going to HR to even call out racism or any discriminative behavior because there is this sense that HR is there to protect the organization as opposed to the people in the actual people as well. But that's what they're there to do. So when you have an employee resource group, it's almost for the people.
Mhm.
So it's a voluntary group that make sure it's diverse so everybody can join. It's not just if you're of that particular characteristic or demographic,
Yeah.
and create those safe spaces and have listening circles, have focus groups, have surveys, and say to people, yes, this is a place that we can talk, just like now.
Yeah.
Ask what you need. If you don't ask, you won't know. And sometimes people say silence means you're compliant. I don't necessarily believe that's true in every case, but obviously that's another trigger. It can seem like, well, if you're not saying nothing, it's because you don't care or because you believe the negative as opposed to wanting to move things forward.
Yeah.
So communication, let the organization know this is why we're talking about it. This is why it's important. It doesn't mean that it's just race that's on the agenda. It means that D&I, diversity and inclusion and belonging, is important to us. However, this is the stream that we're concentrating on, and we know that we will have learnings that will move the organization forward.
Yeah. Okay, lots of food for thought then. Are there organisations that you can think of that you think have got it right, that are managing to facilitate these conversations in an appropriate fashion?
I think the CIPD is doing that. I think we are. We are doing that. And we've had panel conversations. We've got a conversation happening internally in a couple of weeks with two of our SLT senior leadership team, and it's called Getting to Know. So we're doing a Getting to Know session, and it's called Getting to Know senior leadership team through lived experiences, and it's a Q&A session, and it's just for both of them to speak about how they what their career path was. So what was their upbringing like? What challenges have they faced? What racial challenges have they faced? But then we're also going to do the same thing with two of our SLT who are white. So one white female, one and white male. And that way you'll be able to see from a gender perspective, what's the challenges that a Black woman in SLT has had compared to a white woman, but also what's the challenges of a Black man to a white female and a white male. Do you see what I mean? To see, because we all have challenges, don't we?
Yeah.
And we have these conversations. We also had our first one a couple of years ago called Let's Talk Race, and we had a panel discussion again. It was extremely emotional. We'd never done that before. We'd never had an internal conversation about that. We invited globally, the whole, everybody was invited to that. We had a fantastic turnout, and we had lots of questions. We had lots of people asking questions, and it's about the safe space, Elizabeth. It's about letting people feel that they can ask these questions and to understand why we're having them and be challenging. Don't do the groupthink bias and jump on just because everybody's saying this is what we should talk about. If you genuinely don't understand it, say it, because you're entitled to your opinion as well. You don't have to think like everybody else. But I think humanity and being fair is important, and organizations everybody should feel like they want to come to work and they have a voice in that space.
Yeah, and actually one of the attendees has put a question in. I agree that safe spaces are so important, but I'm skeptical they can truly exist in the workplace, and workplace politics and hierarchies get in the way. Do you have any suggestions of how to create safe spaces in the workplace? Thank you for that question. That's a good question.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because when you think about it, discrimination is learned behavior, not work behavior. It's not something you've gone to work and learn. It's something that has to be decoded almost from birth.
Sure.
It's something that, depending on your product of your environment. So with the politics, with the hierarchy, with the non-buy-in, you'll see in a leadership team has to have that buy-in, and so does HR. Where you can't decode every single person that walks through your door into your organization, however, you can have a stamp to say, this is the organization that we are, and this is zero tolerance on every level. We all know that if you break a red light, you're going to get 3 points on your license, probably fined, and potentially you could stop driving. You're not going to do it, right? Because that law is in place, and you know that this is the law. And if you have that in your organization and you stamp that in and you solidify that and you embed that in the very fabric of the organization's values, mission statements, visions, then what you're doing is you're doing organizational cultural change, aren't you? So there is challenge in politics, there is challenges with all the things that you've mentioned in your question, but you need buy-in from the top. But that has to cascade down, and you have to have the buy-in from the bottom to the top. So it has to literally be in the fabric, and it has to be ongoing conversations, and they will be difficult, and it's very difficult to break down politics at work. But if people are openly saying this is what we want to do, you have to hold them accountable. There has to be an accountability from the organization and everybody in the organization.
Thank you, and I hope that has answered the question for you. Nicole, I'm going to ask you to wait around for a bit, if you don't mind, and come back at the end to join us for a panel discussion. Thank you
Yes.
so much for your contribution. And Nicole is actually working with us to deliver some workshops in February and April next year, which look at how to become an effective diversity and inclusion leader. So we're very lucky to have her experience and expertise then as well. The links will be in the chat now, and we will see you later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Bayo Adelaja. Bayo, if I could just trouble you to put your mic and camera on, that would be fantastic. Bayo in 2018 was named as one of the most influential women in social entrepreneurship in the UK by NatWest Bank. And she's worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In 2019, she was chosen as one of the top most influential BAME leaders by the Financial Times and Inclusive Boards. She was also recently the Diversity and Inclusion Consultant at Google for Startups UK. So delighted to have you here today. And we are going to have a conversation more about the technicalities and tools that are needed in order to kick off some of these conversations in the workplace. And as the founder and CEO of Do It Now, which supports Black innovators building tech companies and social enterprises in the UK and across Africa, I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on that. So what tools and resources do you think that companies need to think about providing?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to this wonderful group of people we've got here. I agree with pretty much what Nicole ended the conversation with. I hope I've gotten that name right.
Yes, you do.
There was a flash on your face, and I was just a bit worried. No, so I think it's a lot of political will, if you want. That's the key thing. There has to be senior buy-in, there has to be HR buy-in, and there has to be a lot of willingness from the ground up. So it has to be the majority of your organization has to be willing to change, and that's the part that gets a little bit worrisome when you start trying to implement things. So while it's not a software tool, it certainly is something you need in your toolbox if you're going to make systemic change within your organization. One of the things I tend to do once I start working with an organization is ask for their data. And sometimes you find organizations collect a little bit too much data and then never do anything with it, but feel good about the fact that they have it. And other times you find that they're not doing anything at all, or thankfully some organizations have been collecting data, but sometimes not quite asking the right questions. So as someone that I've had quite a dot around career. I started off in government, and then I moved on to social policy research, and then actually before that I was a tech entrepreneur. So I've done quite a few things, and I've seen thankfully all of those things come together, and it's about creating short form questionnaires that ask the real deal question that you need to know as to how on earth you've gotten to where you are, and how your organizational members can think of new ways to get out of it. So it is about creating space. So that's a tool as well.
Sorry, could you give us an example of what kind of questions then you would include in that, and what sort of data you're trying to harvest?
Sure. I think entry and exit interviews are an incredible tool. So in an entry interview, really understand the motivation of the individual joining your space. I work a lot with charities, so there's a lot of kind of altruistic motivation, and there's a lot of kind of seeking security and seeking to enjoy the workplace. So if you are not actively supporting that and fostering that motivation throughout their time working there, then you're allowing them to become alienated within a space that they're hoping will be a welcoming this is certainly the word that gets used a lot, belonging, or like a space where they can feel real belonging. And if you don't buy into that motivation and you don't support it and foster it, then you are essentially leaving them out to dry and kind of putting them in a position where they're a task filler rather than someone that is actively working in a space. And when you are racialized on top of that kind of lack of access to supporting them as individuals to continue engaging with the motivation of their joining there, then you find that people of color tend to shrink back a lot more, because there are usually not enough opportunities to really say what you mean and kind of say it with your chest and really get the support and the backing of your senior officers to help you get back into a place where you love what you're doing. So as a person of color, it may not be that you're being racially profiled, or it may not be that someone has said something racist. It could just be that you are being allowed to kind of fall by the wayside because the organization itself has not done the basic work of trying to foster a community within the space that allows people to feel safe. So that question earlier about creating safe spaces within the workplace, one of the things that really allows that to happen is active listening, and the pinpoint around that is understanding why the person wants to be there.
Okay, thank you. So if you're now having these conversations, and as you know, somebody who's recovering from coronavirus, the idea of social distancing will be very close to your heart at the moment. How do organisations actually pull that off on using technology, or we're all very disparate at the moment, and so presumably difficult conversations in person are challenging enough, but when we're looking at how to bring in the technology, what would you suggest?
Well, actually, I've always run my organization as a remote one. So we've been testing these out for a while, and thankfully now I get to work with clients on them. One of the things that I've been saying is, as in this time, there is a massive disconnect, especially between racialized and non-racialized people, and in many cases, the senior leadership is entirely white, and then the junior staff, the lower down you go, the more likely you are to find people of color. And so there is such a massive disconnect in this time where race conversations are happening, because you're so positionally separate. So there isn't really that opportunity to build those natural conversations. It's even more so because we're no longer in the same room. So one fantastic way that's been working for a couple of my clients is drop-in sessions. So if you just create a space where people can come in, and it's kind of like a mixer. You come in, everyone has their favorite drink, whether that's a coffee or a glass of wine or a smoothie or a protein shake, whatever it might be. And you just talk about literally anything, preferably not work. It could be an hour, it could be 30 minutes, it could be 15 minutes in little breakout rooms. And you just have a conversation about absolutely anything. It could be something you watched on TV, it could be the latest sport. And those break down the lack of humanity that is usually in corporatized spaces, because you're then just a job role rather than your full personality, and that happens even more so when you're remote. The other thing that I quite like to do is encourage SMT or SLT or boards, whoever, to book in mini meetings with their junior staff. So it's usually called reverse mentoring in a number of different places, but this isn't a long-term situation. This is just let's touch base and find out what's going on with our junior staff, and just have an actual conversation with them, and just open up that dialogue that is, again, not about work, so that they feel like if there is something that has happened, if they do sum up the courage to say it to someone, you are someone that they can speak to about it. Because even if you've just spoken about the fact that I don't know, what is it? Keeping Up with the Kardashians is cancelled or is leaving the airwaves. Even if that was the thing that you were like, oh, I read about this. Isn't this crazy? This is so weird. It's been on for so long. Look at how much money they've made. Even if that's all you spoke about, the fact that you're a senior person in your organization and you're talking about something so relatively trivial to a junior person, and you're just having a back and forth about it, and just maybe try that a couple of times with the same person over a 3-month period, and that familiarity it will grow, and that will allow them to come to you with serious stuff when serious stuff does happen, because it will eventually happen, rather than them just kind of looking for an opportunity to leave.
Yes, absolutely. And as one of the delegates has just commented, those sessions that build trust and connection and break down walls are incredibly useful. So you looking at the idea of training. What would you say are the pros and cons of firstly implementing training programs, and secondly of using somebody who's not in your organisation? Can that have a negative flip side as well as a positive one?
I think it really is up to the feeling within the organization, because when I get called in, or my team gets called in to do something, whether that's a training session or a consultancy session about the race relations specifically, or just diversity and inclusion in a wider sense, it's usually because the team itself does not feel like they're well placed to do that because of the level of mistrust and animosity that has built up.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I wrote into our unconscious bias training is the outcome of kind of this dissociation from the tension in your workplace is that the people that feel disenfranchised and marginalized within that will end up in a position where they are either their only recourse to action is silence, violence, or escape. Now, silence is what most people end up doing. They feel like there's no one to talk to, so they just end up being in a space where they feel unsafe, unsupported, and it has a massive effect on their mental health. And that is not only a risk to them, but it's also a risk to your organization, because their work level goes down, the productivity is off, their effect on the rest of the team is palpable, and it just leads to really awful things all around. So when people are silent in the face of disenfranchisement, that isn't a good thing. The fact that they're not saying it doesn't mean it's not there. Violence doesn't actually mean like punching and kicking. Violence could be an attitude that comes into the workplace that creates kind of a toxic scene where people are actively aggro around their colleagues, and they're just angry that, for instance, around the George Floyd murder, there were so many wonderful people that were so willing to help. And there was a lot of anger that came with that from Black people, because it meant that the white people and other people who were saying, I didn't know it was this bad. Let's talk about it. Let me know how I can help. It entirely disempowered their own experience as a Black person in that workplace, because it meant that you didn't see all of their, to them, obvious cries for help previously. It meant that you didn't care about them, but this guy that died all of the way over there, why did that matter more to you than me, who you see every day? We've gone for a couple of drinks, you know the names of my kids. I mean, I thought we were friends, and suddenly you are saying you care about this thing. Why didn't you care before when I was struggling? So there was a lot of violence in terms of attitude and anger that came with that, and it's entirely justified, because I mean, who would want to know that after years of working somewhere, people have only just realized that you have a hard time because of your race? It's entirely horrible. And then escape. So what most Black people tend to do is, within 3 years of working somewhere, they end up trying to escape the place, because they're realizing they're not being supported, their mental health is suffering, they're not getting promoted, because bias is a real thing. And you, in a snap, you kind of pick your team, because you're like, oh, I have a deadline, I need to do this, we need to get the outcomes. Pick your team, and your team isn't necessarily the best at the job. Your team is who you feel confident about managing or supporting. And if you don't feel yourself having that it factor with someone, and that isn't always a race-based thing, it is a personality-based thing, but the likelihood personality-wise is a mismatch between races, because most white people don't have to hang out with Black people, but Black people have to hang out with white people if we want to succeed in any form of life. So there's this kind of not understanding and trying to fit in from the Black person side, but this white person side not necessarily understanding how to engage, because they've never had to grow up with Black people. They didn't necessarily go to school with Black people. They didn't actively try to engage with Black people. And that's just a geography thing. We're only 3% of the population. So if you didn't grow up with Black people, you work in a space that doesn't really involve Black people, and you don't try to, because it's inconvenient in a high pressured environment to try to actively engage Black people. So there are lots of things that end up with you feeling like, and this has happened to me, it's happened to almost everybody I know. And unfortunately, as Nicole pointed out, we still do say the whole twice as hard thing quite a lot.
Yeah.
It's really baked into into Black identity. Overwork yourself, hoping to get praise and hoping to get supported, only to end up in a position where you are still disenfranchised and marginalized within your own workspace. So escape.
Okay. We've got quite a specific question. What data is useful to collect to ensure that you have a baseline of where your organisation is now and can track progress? And actually, to that, I would ask, how do you track progress? How do you quantify what would be successfully diverse workplace for you?
So there are many ways to figure out diversity, and until the government decides what that is, I think we're just going to have to make it up for ourselves as we go. You can go by your city or your industry. Most people tend to go by where they are based, like the locality. So if you are in, I don't know, Cornwall, my assumption is that there are not many Black people in Cornwall. So if you're in Cornwall, the expectation is that you won't be highly diverse. But if you're in Cornwall seeking to attract a global audience or a UK-wide audience, then your expression of your organization should reflect that audience. So it's up to you as to how you measure that, as long as you feel comfortable about it and your organization has agreed that this is the best way for you. No one can judge you until it becomes something that's comparable to other organizations in the same area and in the same industry who are doing a lot better, and then it becomes a problem. So in terms of that kind of diversity quotas, that's entirely up to you, and it's entirely up to your context. In terms of collecting data, one of the things I think is most important to collect is Warwick University has created a 7-question mental health well-being survey. So it has, I believe it's 7 questions. What is it called? SF5, SF7 something. Anyway, Warwick University created it. And what I like to do is suggest that people bake that into either quarterly or H1, H2 questionnaire that goes out to everybody, and don't make it anonymous. I don't understand why people try to make their questionnaires anonymous all the time. I get that you want your staff to be able to answer truthfully, but if you don't know who they are, you can't follow up and actually ask them how we can help you have a better experience of this. So instead of making it anonymous, just create an opportunity to say, no matter what you put in here, you are not going to get fired. We are not going to hate you. We just need to know so that we can better support you. And opening up that dialogue through a mental health questionnaire, mental health and well-being, questionnaire, then also asking about productivity in the workplace is something that people don't really focus on, because the way that you run your targets and your kind of KPIs and all of those things will run down to your team and how tired they are, how overwhelmed they feel. And the people that are more marginalized, less likely to speak up about feeling run down, because again, twice as hard to get half as much. There's just like I need to overwork myself in order to get anywhere in this workplace. Data that you should really be collecting is there's a bunch of culture surveys that you can get as a template, but it's always good to create your own if you have the time and the resources within your organization to do so. And in that, it would be great to know how your organizational staff, how your team sees you, your organization, how they see your leaders, how other stakeholders within the industry that you're in see you, and how your beneficiaries or customers see you as well. So understanding your place within that and doing that survey every year.
Brilliant. Thank you. I hope that was helpful.
Oh, I just realized I didn't answer the question about pros and cons of external people.
We were about to get on to that.
Oh.
Beautifully linked.
Well, in terms of that, I think honestly, it's up to you as a team to decide, one, whether you can afford it. It's not always that cheap. But two, I think, and bear in mind that I run an organization that provides external training, so
you're slightly biased here.
Yeah, slightly. But no, I do think it is worthwhile to have both. So one of the things that we offer is team building. as part of our opportunity. And I think it's really important to have opportunities within your organization for your staff to run training sessions with each other based on what they think is important to know. So that whole thing of this is something I care about, I'd like to teach you. And just a 30-minute to 45-minute session that people can drop into, and everyone has to go to at least 5 a quarter or something like that, just to engage people with each other. And that doesn't feel like it's diversity and inclusion or race-based or whatever. But honestly, empowering people that don't typically speak up, empowering people that don't typically put themselves out there and engage with the rest of the team on that kind of interest level is really empowering, not only for the rest of the staff to get to know things they wouldn't necessarily know, but it's empowering for you to be able to share your interests in a real way and kind of put yourself out there a little bit, because people respond to vulnerability even in that setting. And then in terms of the external, I think there's a lot to be said for people that do this with a lot of different organizations. Because knowing what you do is great, but in the same way that you hire external consultants for anything, knowing what everybody else does and what you do is better. Not to keep harping on how we do things and what we do, but we do a lot of consultation with the SMT, with the head of people, before we choose which programs to suggest, and then we tailor those specific training sessions to the organization itself as well. So it's, for us at least, it's not a one size fits all. So we're not going in and saying turn up to this thing and it's done. It's very much still about your specific organization. We're just bringing in everything we know from everybody else that we've worked with.
Fantastic. Wow, a lot of food for thought there. And thank you. I'm aware that you have to be somewhere quite soon. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you very much indeed for being with us today when you were probably feeling quite grim. I hope you continue to feel better, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. And Bio is actually one of the fabulous lineup of speakers we have at our Race Equality in the Workplace Summit, which is on the 9th of December. And all of you today will receive a 10% discount to come along to that. The details are in the chat now. And we'll also give away a free place to that event at the end of today's webinar. And I am going to ask Azim Akhtar now to put your camera and microphone on. Bio, take care, thank you. And we are going to have a look at your lovely face quite soon, I hope.
Elizabeth, I'm getting a message saying the host has disabled my camera. You cannot start your video because the host has disabled. Ah, hold on.
There we are. Hopefully,
okay.
that
works.
Well done. Fantastic. Welcome, Azim. And I think in one of the most surreal introductions I've ever done in several years of chairing HR events, Azim and I actually went to school together in Riyadh in the early 1980s, although of course he was probably in kindergarten then. And being in a very ultra-conservative society, we never actually met, although my father taught him geography and shared his soccer obsession. On a less surreal note, Azim is the CTO in BT's Global Services Division and also chair of Active Essex, and sits on the board of Sport England. And in 2016, he was named as one of the top most influential BAME business leaders in the UK. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Delighted to be here, and good morning to everyone. Fantastic session so far.
Fantastic. And can you talk to us a little bit more about your upbringing and the experiences that you have had that shape your opinions today?
Yeah, so as you said, I was delighted to hook up with you again, and your father being my geography teacher at school was a surreal experience. So yeah, as you said, I was born in the UK, grew up in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh from the age of about 8 to about 12, 13, and that was as a Muslim, I didn't really have many issues with it, although it was a very different experience to being in the UK, both before and after. So it was a very conservative society, very monolithic in terms of lots of people, the sexes were segregated. Really, there was really one way of doing things. There wasn't a lot of interaction certainly between men and women. Society was controlled in a very specific way. So to some extent, it made me quite conservative in terms of how I saw the world until I came back to the UK when I was 12, 13, and suddenly was exposed to a whole bunch of new challenges in secondary school, primary school. Didn't really experience racism in Saudi. Our school, as you know, Elizabeth, was very multicultural. We had students from all over the place, including local Saudis. But coming back to the UK, suddenly I came back to the UK in the early 80s, and we were just coming off the back of the race riots in London, in Toxteth, etc., Birmingham. And there was quite a lot of open racism around. You'd get called Paki and words like that. On television, it was accepted. If you watch some early episodes of things like Only Fools and Horses, those sorts of words are used. And I was a little bit taken aback, if truth be told. I'd never felt inferior because of the color of my skin or because of my religion. And suddenly people were really engaging with me on the basis of my religion and the color of my skin. And as I grew up, I guess initially it was very much more about my race as opposed to my religion. So people didn't know we were Muslims, from Hindus, from Sikhs. We were just it was just Johnny Foreigner. Nobody knew the intricacies of Sunnis and Shiites. And then suddenly you got to a point where, a whole bunch of events happened in the Middle East, which caused reverberations across the world. And everybody became an expert on Sunnis and Shiites and Druze and Alawis and everything. And I'd be sitting there thinking, wow, people who didn't know what a Muslim was now suddenly seem to know all the different sects that we have. And with that came a greater degree of understanding with some, but it brought a greater degree of hatred and discrimination as well. So people, I think 9/11 was a key moment in that. Suddenly, I remember when it happened, I went out to the supermarket that evening, and I felt very strongly that life would never ever be the same again.
Yeah.
I almost felt that every time something was going to happen, we were going to be put in the dock, because we were being put in the dock then as Muslims. We were being asked to answer for the crimes of these so-called Muslims who had committed that particular act. And then what's happened since then is every single time there's been some sort of a terrorist outrage, it's unique actually in that Muslims, across the board, whether they're practicing or not practicing, whether they're Sunni or Shiites, or whether, they're old or young, male or female, we get put in the dock. We get asked, can you please what are your views on the teacher that got beheaded? Do you condemn that? And it's almost as if, you've got to answer for your religion. You've got to answer for a whole bunch of, 2.2 billion people in the world. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, has been something which has led to sort of a polemic society. It's alienated people, which has been, upsetting. So I would say the conversations that used to happen, which were very productive and very, held in a really good nature about, so what exactly do you believe? They became much more about, so is it true that when you die, you get 72 virgins? And is it true, lots of things, sound bites that people had heard, which the media was whipping up, So the media, especially in the Blair and George Bush, W. Bush era, both here and on the other side of the pond, there was a lot of sound bites that came out about Islam, about Muslims, about things that we believe and things we don't believe and things we can do and can't do, which basically became the way in which people perceived Muslims. And then the unfortunate thing was that nobody wanted to engage and really find out what we really believed. They just carried these thoughts. And that has led to, I think, systemic Islamophobia. And it's led to systemic discrimination against Muslims in every aspect of society. Mesut Ozil, the Arsenal footballer, I'm a huge Liverpool fan, but I saw Mesut Ozil, the Arsenal footballer, he tweeted something about the Uyghur Muslims in China, and the fact that, speaking up as a humanitarian, he's speaking up about the oppression there. And he was censored by his club, by football, by everybody. Whereas, when something similar happened in Nigeria later, then, that somebody else said that, then that was permissible. So it feels to me, and it feels to a lot of Muslims, as if we're fair game, which I think is a really unfortunate outcome of all of that. I don't know if I've answered your question, but hopefully that gives you a view of how we felt.
Fascinating, thank you. And the idea of diversity and misconception, you know, as a barrier to diversity in the workplace is something that we've talked about before. And what are some of the misconceptions that you feel people hold about Islam, particularly in the workplace?
Well, I think you know, Muslims in Islam, it is quite a prescriptive religion. So let's be absolutely honest. I think there is a need for sincerity and honesty on both sides. So
Yeah.
we've got to be absolutely honest about what our religion is and what it says and what we can and can't do. And at the moment, and now for quite some years, I think a lot of Muslims feel that they have to almost hide and stifle their voices and hide what we believe, just in case it's going to then, you know, people are going to think they're a terrorist. People are going to think, oh, he's a bit too practicing. You know, he or she isn't the sort of person we want as the face of our company, etc. So, you know, there are things, you know, we have to pray 5 times a day, and that becomes quite a challenge, especially in, you know, in Europe during the winter where the days are so short. So 3 prayers come very close together, and that causes people to, you know, you have to, you know, we're not allowed to miss our prayers. It's a non-negotiable, and it's a very important part of being a Muslim. And I think, you know, those folks who want to pray should be able to feel that they can go off and pray without feeling as if they're being judged. And usually they're getting judged in the context of, as I said, some of the macro events that are happening around the world. That, you know, if you're praying, well, he must, you know, I've been at airports and I've wanted to pray, and then you look at people, if there's no prayer room, you're praying somewhere in the corner, and then people getting nervous because you're going to get on that plane, which is incredible. So it's, you know, that's the sort of thing that you don't want people to feel, and you don't want to alarm and scare anyone. But I think in the workplace specifically, what we're seeing is that Muslims, I've seen, are very keen to stay, you know, below the radar, not raise their heads above the parapet. And there's a real fear culture to some extent in that. And one of the things I always do whenever I do a talk such as this and get any kind of platform, and I didn't do it today because I forgot, is to say that I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of BT as a CTO there. I'm not speaking on behalf of Active Ethics as chairman or as a board member at Sport England. These are my personal views. And the fact that I feel I have to say that is indicative of the fact that there is a problem, right? So what I say, I should feel comfortable that I'm not going to say anything which would fall foul or be in contravention of any of those 3 organizations. And I don't think it would. But again, because of policy, etc., I don't want to in any way embarrass my employers or the organizations I'm affiliated with. But I think it's really important that people in the workplace, Muslims in the workplace, feel confident that they have a voice, that they can use that voice, and that people will not judge them, and that they deal with Muslims with a very open mind, as opposed to the kind of you know, the narrative that's pushed by the media, in particular the establishment. It's not helped. I don't want to get political, but it's not helped by the kind of government we have right now, where we've had the Prime Minister himself and a number of his ministers say things which are, I mean, there's no other way of saying it, but they've said things which are blatantly racist and Islamophobic. There's definitely an Islamophobia problem within the Conservative Party. And whilst the anti-Semitism issue was raised in the Labour Party, and that was something which had to be addressed, quite rightly so, the Islamophobia one in the Conservative Party hasn't been addressed. And that, I think, just creates this general culture that not just, you know, in the political level, but across society, in the workplace, that, well, if there's a degree of Islamophobia, well, you know, we'll turn a blind eye to that. And that, I think, is hugely, hugely counterproductive.
Okay. And the idea of workplace diversity means, what does it look like for you? So
first of all, I think it's important to say why diversity in the workplace is so important. You know, as and I've been to Saudi many times for work after that. Saudi is the classic place where, you know, I would go to meetings in some organization and everybody in the room from the client side would be male. They would all be wearing exactly the same clothes. They would all be, if they were Western educated, most of them had been to the same universities, even in the US and in the UK. They all even supported the same football team. So it was either Liverpool or horrible Manchester United. So, and that obviously straight away put me off. But so you had this group of people who were senior execs making decisions about, let's say, broadband strategy or some other marketing strategy, etc., for their whole country. And they were a homogenous, monolithic group of people. And there was no creativity in that group. They all violently agreed with each other.
Yeah.
So that was an example where the opposite of diversity and the kinds of decisions it leads to. So there wasn't, you know, will our product be the kind of product that women want to buy? You know, how will it deal with different demographics, different ethnicities, different religions, etc. So there wasn't any of that input. So you get a decision which is very appropriate for one specific part of society, but not for everybody else. And what diversity does is it leads to better decision making. It leads to a more inclusive outcome. So whenever you make a decision, what you're doing is you're bringing everybody on board. It's a consensual way of doing things. And basically, you're going to be more successful. So if at the end of the day, it's all about bottom line, which it always is,
yeah, of course.
you know, what you're doing is you're basically coming up with something which is going to be more productive, it's going to be more profitable. And at its heart, not being diverse is a suboptimal model, because what you're not doing, if you don't have diversity and you're not giving people the chance to apply for roles and get into organizations, then by definition, you're bringing in somebody who isn't as good as the other person. So
Yeah.
as a result of that, you've got a suboptimal team and you will get suboptimal results. And that's what we've seen. We've seen that not just in the UK, we've seen that across the board. And you know, one thing we've been very good at in the UK is I think we are a very tolerant society by and large.
Yeah.
I think the UK, certainly in terms of the Western Hemisphere, is you know, I wouldn't want to live anywhere other than the UK, certainly nowhere in Europe. I think there's the same open-mindedness. I think we've got a lot of challenges here, and the fact that we're having conversations such as this shows that we're willing to take on those challenges.
Yeah.
But you know, these sorts of conversations aren't even happening in countries like Hungary or in Poland or you know, other places like that. And I think that's really, really important to feel that these conversations are going to happen, but there's going to be some kind of outcome from them.
Okay, I'm going to ask Nicole to come back in. Because there's a comment I'd like both of you to think about here. One of our delegates, hello, I'm struggling to understand perception and intent on accusations of race discrimination. How can we make sure we handle discrimination correctly and fairly? Nicole, would you like to take first stab at that?
Yeah, because it's quite a lot there, so I'm going to try and break it down. So the person's asked, they're finding it difficult to understand perception and intent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how
Yes.
would you treat discrimination fairly?
Yeah, how do we handle it fairly? Accusations of discrimination.
Well, it would be like any policy that you have in place, and let people understand what those policies and those guidelines are within the organisation, so people know exactly what the process is around this. What do you class as discriminatory actions? And giving people the safe space to be able to say, yes, I've heard this, and this is how, you know, I want you to deal with it. It goes back to trust, to be honest. And when it comes to fairly, all of your policies should be fair. They should all be in line with each other. This is no difference. I think being in this space now is that race seems to be so difficult, but it's not. It's just doing the right thing, as you would with anything else. It's just because it's uncomfortable. And when things are uncomfortable, that's when it becomes complicated. And it's not. The policy should be in line with any other policy, but they all should be at the same level. And so if you're dealing with it fairly, it's a matter of, has your HR department, do they understand what discrimination is then? And I'm not being patronizing, but we are talking about human beings here. What does that look like? You know, so if somebody does come and say, I've heard somebody say this about somebody Muslim in the canteen or in a meeting, how do you signpost that? How do you call that out? What happens next? Be very clear around the safety around that, and that you will take action. Around the perception and, was it intent?
Yes, perception and intent.
I think as an organisation as well, you have to ask yourself, why are you doing this? I think lots of organisations are doing it, but what's the why? Because if the why is not clear, then you're not believable, and it goes back to tokenism and being on the bandwagon. Why are you doing this? How is this going to help the organisation? What's in it for me? Unfortunately, everybody's kind of selfish to an extent. Like, so why should I do this? Why should I go to that training? Why, what are we doing this for? Is this just more work because we want to look like we're doing something? And the answer is, let your organization know why you're doing it. What's the reasoning behind it? And going back to data quickly, I would say, I hate saying quick wins. So I would say hanging fruits would be, if you have a organization survey, just asking your normal, your ordinary questions, put diversity and inclusion questions in there. Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like your HR department would do something if I was to call out discrimination? Get the sense of you, get the sense and the hub of the organization. Have you said to people, you can put your pronouns? What are pronouns? What do they mean? Make people feel that they feel comfortable to put she or her or them or he, and that you're not going to be discriminated against. I know Bio said beforehand around not making surveys anonymous, but if you haven't created that safety and that trust, people won't answer it. So I would say, if you're going to go anonymous, but move to encouraging people to speak up. So if you do have an organization meeting, you use Slido and get people to ask those questions. Because for me, the bottom line is giving people the safety to say it.
Yeah.
And then you move on to, I want to know who said it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so think about the question, and in your team meetings, in your one-to-ones, have the conversation. Ask people, and ask what their blockages are. Not just about saying talk about race or talk about discrimination. Why do you think it's difficult for the organisation not to talk about it? What's your personal views around this? What do you think we could be doing differently? Get people involved.
Okay, and sort of following on to your point about safety there, Azim, this one would be probably appropriate for you. The recent resignation of the FA chairman has raised discussion where some have been surprised about the strength of the reaction, and has this case been to the detriment of safe spaces, do you think? I think the fact that he used the phrase coloured and has since resigned. What are your thoughts on that? As a sportsman and as an advocate of diversity?
Yeah, I just want to pick up, to answer that question, I just want to pick up something which I sort of really agree with that Nicole just said around sincerity. I think it's really, really important that the folks who are involved in addressing this problem, whether it's in corporates, whether it's at whatever level, at the political level, there has to be sincerity. So as Muslims, we're taught to constantly check our intention in every act that we do. And with checking your intention, you will get sincerity. And what I find very often is that exactly, I think, as Nicole was sort of alluding to, you get to a point sometimes where in organizations at every level, you've got a tick box type exercise going on. And that doesn't serve, of benefit to anybody. It doesn't serve a benefit to any part of society. I think what you've got to have is a real desire to sincerely address this problem at a grassroots level, really sort of get to the bottom of it. So just remind me, sorry, of the question again, because I've sort of digressed a little bit.
No, that's fine. It's talking about the recent resignation of the FA chairman.
Oh yeah, about Greg Clark, yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, he's used a term which many people would find offensive. And this is, again, it just, for me, it sometimes feels as if we're dealing with the symptoms of the disease, not the underlying disease. If he's resigned for that, then when Boris Johnson said that Muslim women look like letterboxes or burglars or whatever, he should resign for that. Some of the things Priti Patel has said are shocking. Dominic Cummings, the whole bunch. Every one of these folks should resign. We've got to hold everybody to the same standard. It can't be that he should go for saying that. And I think we've also got to be careful not to fall down the rabbit hole of political correctness where someone is saying something and they clearly don't mean it in a way to offend somebody. And it usually comes out of lack of understanding. The woke culture we have now almost dictates what you can and can't say. And I often don't know what I can say or can't say. I remember watching something and on television, and I'm not sure if this was a joke, and the one guy referred to another guy as an Eskimo, and he said, well, no, you can't say that. You have to say Inuit. And I would have said Eskimo. So I wasn't sure whether that's just a joke or whether that's something now which is the new norm. But what I don't want is an overly politically correct society. I want to see substance in terms of sincerity. I want to see that you've got a leader, a prime minister, a cabinet that are genuinely wanting to have a fully inclusive society where everybody's contribution is valued across the board. And where it's not just about tokenism, where, you know, you see Greg Clark, he says something, he resigns, and then a whole bunch of people say, oh, look, it's the bloody woke crowd again, the politically correct crowd. You can't say anything these days without being called a racist. Well, you know if you're a racist. Everyone who is racist knows they are racist. Everyone, you know, I get this so many times, well, we're not being racist because Islam isn't a race. So we get that one a lot. And I'm saying, well, no, you're just a nasty person then. So whether you're a racist or whether you're an Islamophobe, you're basically a nasty person, right? That I don't want to have anything to do with. So let's just be clear about that. I think that's really important. So there needs to be sincerity. I'm not for this whole, you know, if he apologized and he says he didn't mean it in that way, then, you know, I'd be comfortable with that. But as I say, if people are saying these things and they're not mindful of the fact that they are genuinely offending people, one standard for everybody.
Okay, and Nicole, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think this topic, honestly, I agree with Azim. I think we have to be careful that we're not just having scapegoats and we're not just looking at the symptoms and not the disease. You know, it's just like taking painkillers and you're just masking the pain. And I'm now speaking as Nicole as a part, not as a CIPD. When I first read that article and I saw what he resigned for, I literally went, oh my God, because I just feel that you're closing it down. You're closing the conversations down. And I'm not making excuses. I look at his generation, and I think I've already said here that my grandmother used to use the word coloured. Now, everybody has their own reasons why they're offended by things. And this is why the power of language is so important.
Yeah.
But like Azim just said, we've had people who have said worse and they're still in post.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that he shouldn't have resigned, but I think this was a perfect opportunity to really have a public conversation about this and for him to also speak about that. I don't know if he's a racist or not. I don't know this person, but we're looking at generations. We're looking at language. We're looking at why does this offend? Because the word coloured doesn't offend me because my nan used to use it. But if you look at the history of the word coloured and where this has evolved from, it could be seen as highly offensive. I know people who don't like people of colour because they feel that it sounds like coloured. I don't like BAME. If I'm completely honest, I don't like the word black. I'm opening a can of worms here. Because when I think of black, I think of evil, I think of dark, I think, you know, it's not, and you know, when you think of white, you think of pure, you think of angelic. So lots of people might say, okay, Nicole, so you've just gone and said all of that. So what should we say? Exactly. It just lets you know that we're human beings, for God's sake. Why do we even have these labels? The fact that nobody can agree on what we should be called is just absurd. It's like the word black is so negative, but a whole race of people are called black. My grandson calls me yellow. He thinks I'm a Simpson. It's like, what? I'm like, but I'm black. He's like, no, grandma, you're not. You're yellow. I'm like, okay, let's work with that for now. You know, but do you see what I mean? So for me, it's like, it's difficult, but we have to push through the uncomfortableness because now people will not say anything. And if we have an argument, Elizabeth, and every time I speak, you don't say anything, I'm going to assume that you're upset because of A, B, and C, but it could be X, Y, and Z. But because you don't feel comfortable enough to say to me, Nicole, it's not actually that. I don't want to be speaking at events and talking about microaggressions if everybody in the room already understands it. I want to hear what you don't understand so we can open up the communication and get it right. It might be difficult, but some things are difficult. You know, because if your partner keeps doing something, if you don't tell them what they're doing, it's going to become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And then that resentment sets in and then you could end up breaking up because of what? So we're human, right? And the way we do one thing is the way we do everything or most things. So to me, that was a perfect opportunity to really blow the power of language open. And the fact that he resigned, I don't really have a comment on that. But going back to what Azim has said, we have had terrible things that have been said and has been allowed to be said, and these people are still in post. So if we're talking about equity, that should be on every single level for everybody. So for me, it was a little bit disappointing because I think there was a missed opportunity there, to be fair.
Conversation,
I do.
You agree, Azim?
I totally agree. And, you know, just to sort of elaborate the point slightly further, you know, when people find out, for instance, what Churchill stood for and what he was all about and some of the things he did, and they still regard him as some great hero, that I find hugely offensive. You know, a man who, by his own admission, had used words like he wants to exterminate Indians, he he engineered a famine which killed 1 million people in Bengal before partition. Some of the things that he said about other parts of the world, non-white parts of the world, absolutely shocking. So if someone still holds an individual like that up, no person in their right mind would ever hold up Hitler as a paragon of virtue or as a war leader. But it feels almost as if the standard that you have is dependent on who the victims were. So if it was certain victims, then actually, no, then Churchill's good. He's a great guy. Let's put a statue up in Parliament Square. And then when someone turns around and says, well, actually, you know what? I'm British, but I'm originally from that part of the world. And he wasn't very nice to us. In fact, he regarded us as being like cockroaches and he wanted to kill us all. Then people are like, well, don't you think you're being overly sensitive? Well, no, not really. So, but we're happy for, there's a culture where Greg Clark has to resign for using the word coloured. So that's the sort of weird dichotomy that we've got. We've got to have some sense of what offends people and what's offensive and what's hurtful is clear and it's manifest. And people to just get upset about little things like this. And sometimes I think that these things happen, like Greg Clark being made to resign, is because there's, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's because it puts the wind in the sails of the folks who think we are overly woke or we are overly politically correct because, oh, look now what these guys have done. And again, I just feel it's all about sincerity. Sorry to keep on coming back to this. There's got to be sincerity in this. Yeah. And just one final point on this, and I don't want to use something that Donald Trump said when he talks about make America great again, but I genuinely believe that we could make Britain great again by becoming a multicultural, inclusive, thought leadership society where everybody is asked to participate and contribute, and that we are greater than the sum of our parts. And that's the legacy we could have for future generations, not us thinking back and always harping on about how oppressive the Brits were in the Indian subcontinent, or what they did in Kenya, or what they did in Australasia or in America. So, we could create a new legacy of proper thought leadership, and we could become economically much more viable than we are right now by making the most of all of the different people that we've got within our society and being colorblind and being religion blind. And at the moment, the folks that are driving the agenda, the establishment, they're pushing us towards a place where we're just going to, Brexit happened because, so many xenophobes, I don't want to get political, but so many xenophobes pushed Brexit through. Is that really going to be great for us? Well, we'll find out. I suspect it won't be. But again, I'm just concerned about, not just for myself as a Muslim, not just myself as a brown person. I want this country to prosper. And I want us to all prosper. And we're all in it together. And I want to see how we can make Britain great again. And I want us to be great because we're inclusive. Everybody prospers. Everybody does well. White, brown, black, everybody, every religion.
I think that's a very beautiful point to end on, actually. I'm so sorry we've run over time. We could probably carry this on for days. We will revisit this subject on the 9th of December. Mark Lancaster, we would like to offer you a free place to come along. And I just want to say thank you very, very much indeed to all our panelists today. Your contribution has been extraordinary. And we thank you so much for coming along and sharing your experiences with us. And if not before, we will see you in January. If Carrie allows Boris to let us celebrate, we'll see. We're not entirely sure who's in the driving seat anymore. But I wish you all peace and good health. And thank you very much indeed for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.